The stench hit them first, a cloying sweetness that curdled the air, a scent so abhorrent that even hardened veterans of the battlefield recoiled. It was January 28, 1547, and the king was dead. Courtiers, accustomed to the opulent perfumes and fresh herbs that usually masked the royal chambers, stumbled back, gagging. Dogs, drawn by an instinct as ancient as fear itself, sniffed greedily at the floor, their tongues darting towards dark, viscous puddles. This wasn't the dignified passing of a great monarch. It was a horror show. For centuries, Tudor historians meticulously crafted a narrative of Henry VIII's final days, a peaceful transition for a king who, despite his ruthlessness, remained an imposing figure. But the truth, buried within obscure medical records and long-forgotten eyewitness accounts, painted a far more gruesome picture. Henry, once the Golden Prince, the epitome of Renaissance virility, had transformed into a monstrous figure, ravaged by disease and madness. His death, far from peaceful, was a terrifying descent into decay, a secret his government desperately tried to bury for 450 years. This hidden history, unearthed through newly analyzed court physician notes and forensic insights, reveals a story so shocking it redefines everything we thought we knew about the Tudor dynasty. The man who executed 2 wives and reshaped an entire nation's religion met an end so undignified, so horrifying, that his own government covered it up. And it all began with a single catastrophic jousting accident that would slowly rot him from the inside out. The air crackled with anticipation on January 24, 1536, at Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, at 44, was still a formidable figure, a king who reveled in physical prowess. Mounted on his massive warhorse, he thundered down the tilt-yard, the afternoon sun glinting off his bespoke armor, each piece a fortune in itself. The ground vibrated with the thunder of hooves as 2 armored titans hurtled towards each other. Then, a horrifying silence descended. The horses collided with the force of a modern car crash. Henry's 300-pound armored body, a mix of man and metal, crashed to the frozen ground. The crowd gasped, their horror palpable, as his destrier, a colossal warhorse in its own suit of armor, stumbled and fell directly on top of the king. The tilt-yard froze. Courtiers, too terrified to move, could only stare, their minds racing. Was the king dead? Had England just lost its monarch to a sport? For 2 agonizing hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious, England without a king. 2 hours Ware and Bullen, desperately hoping for a male heir, waited in agony for news. 2 hours that would irrevocably alter the course of history. When Henry finally regained consciousness, witnesses reported something profoundly unsettling. The bright, intelligent charm that once sparkled in his eyes was gone, replaced by a darker, unpredictable glint. His first words were not relief at survival or concern for his subjects. Instead, he erupted in a furious rage, demanding to know why the tournament had been stopped. The charming Renaissance prince, a man who could speak 4 languages, compose music, dance until dawn, and debate theology with Europe's finest minds, never fully returned from the tilt-yard that day. In his place emerged a paranoid tyrant prone to violent mood swings that would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists poring over historical records now believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the area controlling personality and impulse control. The evidence is compelling. Before the accident, Henry had shown remarkable restraint for a monarch of his era. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking annulment, and had executed relatively few nobles compared to his predecessors. But after January 1536, the executions began in earnest, and Bullen lost her head just 4 months later. Thomas Cromwell, his most trusted advisor, would follow. The king's rages became legendary. Servants reported finding him weeping uncontrollably one moment, then screaming for blood the next. But the brain injury was just the beginning of Henry's medical nightmare. The same accident that scrambled Henry's personality also reopened an old wound on his leg that would never heal again. Most people don't realize that Henry had suffered a previous leg injury years earlier, probably from another jousting accident. It had healed, leaving only a small scar. But the 1536 accident tore that old wound wide open, and in Tudor England, without antibiotics or understanding of infection, an open wound was often a death sentence, a very slow one. Imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days or weeks, but for 11 years, constantly weeping pus, never fully scabbing over. The pain was so intense that even the gentlest touch of silk bed sheets would make him scream. Court physician Dr. Thomas Vickers' secret notes, hidden in the Royal College of Physicians and only discovered in the 1960s, describe ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice daily, filling bronze bowls with infected fluid that servants would quickly remove from the royal presence. But Henry, in his vanity and paranoia, desperately tried to hide this deterioration. Henry's desperation to hide his grotesque condition led to increasingly bizarre measures. He designed special gutters with lead weights to compress the wounds, believing pressure would force them closed. Instead, this cut off circulation and exacerbated the infection. He doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with ambergris to mask the stench. He even instructed his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous power stance we all recognize. The infection wasn't just destroying his legs, it was poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, traveling to his brain, his liver, his heart. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in contemporary accounts suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that releases a constant stream of bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout the body. These toxins caused a cascade of symptoms that would have made Henry's life a living hell. The constant pain would have been excruciating. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever had, but in your legs, never stopping for over a decade. The fever would come and go, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next. His appetite would swing wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger. Most devastating were the neurological effects. The toxins crossing into his brain tissue would cause violent mood swings that had nothing to do with his actual emotions. One moment he might be laughing at a jest, the next ordering the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became commonplace. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already hunting for number 4. The young Catherine Howard caught his eye, a girl of perhaps 17 to his 50 years. The contrast must have been grotesque. Here was a king so obese, he needed servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly found his advances so repulsive she needed wine to endure his bed. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. The ulcers, which had been manageable if disgusting for 6 years, suddenly worsened. Dr. Vickers' notes describe a change in the color and smell of the discharge. Where once it had been yellow-white pus, now it turned green, then brown. The smell evolved from merely foul to something witnesses described as the stench of death itself. Henry's weight exploded during this period. Unable to exercise due to the leg pain, eating constantly to distract from his misery, he ballooned from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armor from 1540, preserved in the Tower of London, shows a 48-inch waist. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned with a 54-inch waist measurement. Let that sink in. 54 inches, that's larger than most modern refrigerators are wide. The palace itself had to be modified to accommodate the king's new bulk. Doorways were widened. You can still see the construction marks at Hampton Court. Floors were reinforced with additional beams after the king's weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with arms that could be removed because Henry could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just furniture that needed modification. The king's daily routine became an elaborate performance designed to hide his deterioration. He would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring for servants to manage his massive limbs. A system of pulleys and slings was installed to lift him upright. He would then be transferred to a wheeled chair, though this was carefully concealed from public view. The physical transformation was matched by an equally disturbing mental deterioration. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior that went beyond mere bad temper into the realm of madness. Henry would hold entire conversations with people who weren't there. He was observed arguing with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He would call out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11 years old. Most disturbing were his interactions with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the king suddenly stop mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of color, staring at empty air. He would whisper, "No, not now," or "Leave me," before exploding in rage at his confused counselors. One particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. "I took your head once, I'll take it again," he shrieked. The king's paranoia reached extraordinary heights. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. He would demand that the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. He hired food tasters not just for his meals but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin first to test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognizable as human. Contemporary accounts describe a massive figure propped up in his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, features distorted by fluid retention. His eyes, once a bright blue that poets compared to summer skies, had become yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep in pouches of discolored flesh. The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to disguise, despite pounds of perfume, the regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered on the floors. The stench of decay followed Henry wherever he went. Courtiers would discreetly hold pomanders, balls of perfume, to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before the king. January 1547. Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII enters his final decline. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was clearly visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, clear evidence of gangrene setting in. The smell had become unbearable. Servants fainted while changing the king's bed sheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January weather because the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin had turned a sickly yellow from liver failure, the whites of his eyes matching, giving him an inhuman appearance. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely speak, his words coming out as wet gargling sounds that required his closest servants to interpret. His breath smelled of rotting meat, a sign that the infection had spread to his digestive system. On January 20th, Henry experienced what physicians now recognize as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins, began shutting down. His urine, when he could produce any, was dark brown and reeked of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and causing agonizing pressure on his other organs. On January 27th, Henry suffered a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely, drool pooled on his pillow, and his speech became completely incomprehensible. Yet, even in this state, paralyzed and rotting, Henry tried to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he attempted to sign death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk. The signature was an illegible scroll, more ink blot than name. Only Henry's death the next day saved Norfolk from the scaffold.